Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the MD-80 Masterclass here. I'm your host, Mustafa, and I'm going to guide you through various aircraft systems today, and we're going to be starting with the electrical system. Before we get started, though, let me just briefly remind you to hit that like and subscribe button if you like what you see here today. You can also add your comments down in the comments section, and please do join the Discord, link in the description down below. To ask any questions there. That's the best place to ask questions. And while I do post the occasional video here to YouTube, my most active portion on the internet is over on Twitch, where I live stream every week. And you can find that at twitch.tv/Mustafa. Again, link down in the description below. Please consider checking that out sometime and joining a very awesome community over there where we do mostly flight sim, but some other stuff as well. All right, let's dive right in. Today we are talking about the electrical system on the MD-82. And so for that, we're going to need some power, because what good is talking about electrical if we don't have any power? So like we talked about in the Cockpit Familiarization episode, we have our electrical panel is all right here. So that's where we're going to spend the lion's share of our time in this episode. And we do have external power available. Now, a couple ways to get this. Like we talked about before, from the tablet, you can go over into here, and I might as well go over here. Under Aircraft Services and Ground, you can select GPU, and that will turn that on. Now, if that doesn't work, it probably means because you have GSX integration turned on, which means you have to call for that through the GSX menu. If that is synchronized services with GSX Pro right there. So, which is what I have. So you'd need to go to your GSX menu, whether it's the top menu or through Flow, which you should really get Flow. You go over here to additional services, and you can call or dismiss the GPU right there. Okay, so we already have that connected. That's already set up for us. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn that power on right now. You have the left bus and the right bus. The external power is available. Now, realistically, before we would check this, we would go over here to our gauges, and we would set this, first of all, to the battery volt section, and we would check our battery volts on this gauge. The top one is amps, the bottom one is volts, and this is positive amps, positive volts, negative volts, and we're looking for better than 24 volts, basically, and we've got clearly over 25, so we got a good battery. If you had less than that, you'd want to call maintenance because you got a problem. At this point, we really shouldn't have anything on the battery because the battery's not even on right now. So we're drawing no amps, and we can look over at our external power and see external power is showing us about 115 volts. The scale here, 100 and 150, and this would be 125. So yeah, right about 115 or so. And then the frequency, or the hertz, aviation generally uses about 400 hertz for their systems. And you can see we're just a little bit above that, but the scale here is 420, that's 410, which means it's probably about 403 hertz or so, which is very fine. So we're a little bit high, but it's more than fine. And the way we know that is that this goes blue. When the parameters are good and we verify them on the gauge, then the light goes blue and tells us it's available. Now, before we put external power on, we would want to put the battery switch on. The battery switch is not right there. That's the master for the APU. The battery is this guy right down here below the emergency power in use light. It says BAT, and it's kind of hidden behind the switch. And this is a 3-position switch. It's actually off, on, and lock. And so I'm going to do this, and you're going to see what happens. I'm going to click it once, and we'll hear a little bit of noise as the battery is engaged. And if I click it again, it turns. You see that turn right there? That means it's locked. And in the real aircraft, I wouldn't be able to just run my hand up there and accidentally knock it off and switch it off. It's just a protection. So you always want to on and lock the battery in use. We'll see the EOAP coming alive there, some other little things coming alive, random little lights in the cockpit. Not much runs off the battery. The battery is very, very, emergency only kind of thing. So now we can go over here and turn on the buses one at a time. And it will make the noise, and autopilot's totally normal. And it should do it both times. So we get that there. You get the fans kicking on. The avionics fans are kicking on. You get a lot of noise in the cockpit now. Things are starting to come to life. And that is how we activate the electrical system on the MD-80. Everything is starting to come on. So, but now let's talk through the electrical system and how this works here on the MD-80. And so for that, we're going to really just kind of focus on this panel. And the panel is laid out in a way that kind of gives us an indication of how these systems work, which is great. So you see these little white lines coming through here. These are our buses. Now, a bus is just you think of it as a collection of devices or even a bus bar sometimes. The way I like to think of it is just a big rod. And anything you connect to that rod is on that bus. So it's not like a school bus, but if you had two separate rods, metal rods, and you connected different things to the other rod, then you have a second bus. And so on this aircraft, they have separated the electrical system and the components for the sake of redundancy and for the sake of not losing everything should something fail, onto the left and the right AC and DC bus. So if you're not familiar with electricity, there's two types of electricity. There is AC, or alternating current, which is what is the electricity that is delivered to the sockets in your house. And then there is DC, or direct current, and that is the kind of electricity that comes out of things like batteries and is usually what most of your devices actually use and requires a transformer and a... well, it doesn't necessarily require a transformer, but it does require some diodes, at least, to make what we call a rectifier, to rectify that AC into DC current. Basically, split the sine wave in half and make it only go on one side, and you have current flowing only in one direction, whereas an alternating current, the current flows back and forth. There are great videos on YouTube all over the place explaining the difference between alternating and direct current. I encourage you to watch those because knowing the difference and how these things work actually gives you a better working knowledge of how these airplanes function, and you can kind of understand better when things start to go wrong and failures happen if you have an understanding of the working principles. We're not going to go into that in this video. That is way too in the weeds for what we're doing here, but just know we have the AC system and the DC system. The DC system comes from the battery. The AC system comes from generators, either external power or the APU or the engines. And the DC power, for the most part, aside from the battery, comes from transformer rectifier units that are driven off of the left and right AC buses. Okay, that was a lot of words, but hopefully that makes sense. We may have to go back and listen to that a few times. So what we're going to do, we're going to follow the path of the electricity here to understand how the electrical system works. So first of all, we have several gauges over here. The top two are AC gauges. This is a voltage and frequency. That was the hertz we talked about. So AC is measured in the, if you want to think of it as electrical pressure, is the kind of the best analogy I've heard, is the voltage of the electricity. The amount of the electricity you are pushing through the wire is the current, or the amps. And so that is if you think about the water analogy, that is the amount of water flowing through the pipe versus the pressure of the water in the pipe. And then the hertz is the amount of time, because we're talking about AC here, it's alternating current. The amount of times the current flips back and forth its direction. In your house, if you're in the United States, it's 60 hertz. If you're in a lot of other parts of the world, in Europe, a lot of times it's 50 hertz. So 50 times a second or 60 times a second. In aviation, because we have much more sensitive equipment, it switches back and forth 400 times a second, or 400 hertz. So those are AC gauges. Down here are our volts and amps for the DC system. And so if we need to see our readouts on the how much amps we're drawing off the current, the only thing we won't have a frequency on DC, because DC doesn't have a frequency. It's all direct current. It goes in one direction, doesn't change direction. So you have volts, the pressure, and you have the amp draw, the amount of current that the system is requiring. The system down in the aircraft is basically a 24, 25 volt system. So that's very kind of similar to like your battery in your car is usually a 12 volt battery, so it's like double that. So little more high power. Below that is our APU gauges. So we're going to talk about those in a moment, but we're going to ignore those. So these are the gauges we care about for that. Over here, we have the gauges for the amperage, but it's not really amperage, it's load. You can kind of think of it the same way, but it's not measured in amps. It's actually measured in percent, which can be a little confusing. But you have the load of the generator, the APU generator, and then the load of the left and right generator. And so what you're looking at here is not 5, 10, and 15. There's a decimal there. What you're actually looking at is 25%, 50%, 100%, 150% of generator load. So you obviously always want to make sure that needle is below the 1.0 mark, because if you go beyond that, you're actually overloading your generator. It will do it, but it's going to run hot and you could burn it out and blow it up. You don't want to do that. So it's why we don't always necessarily run all of the things on the ground off the APU, because you can overload the APU. So those are there. Right above that is our CSD oil temperatures. Now the CSD on an aircraft is the constant speed drive. Sometimes these have different names in some of the newer aircraft now, but and I can't remember what they're called now off the top of my head, but CSD is the old way of doing it. Basically, you have an engine running at different speeds, but you always want your generator to be outputting 400 hertz. Well, how do you do that? You got to make sure your generator runs at a constant speed. So there's gearing and all kinds of fancy stuff that happens in the CSD to make sure whatever the output shaft changes on the engine, as long as it's above a certain speed, will output a constant speed to those generators. And so obviously that takes cooling oil to alleviate the friction. And so that's what these gauges are measuring, is the friction temperature of that oil. And you have a rise and you have a normal thing. So you have push for rise. This is the normal oil temperature in the CSD, and then you have a rise. And the issue there is you have the inner gauge is the temperature, the outer gauge is the rise. And what you expect to see on a CSD is a certain temperature of the oil, but then the outlet temperature should have a bit of a temperature rise from the inlet temperature of the CSD. Because the oil is going into the CSD, it's going to heat up as it absorbs all that heat, and it's going to come out the other end, it's going to go to the oil cooler, and it's going to come back, it's going to repeat the cycle and over and over and over again. What you don't want to have happen, if you don't want to have zero rise, because that means something's not working, or the oil's not flowing, so that's an indication of a problem. But too much rise also indicates a problem. So you have this button here to see, right now the rise is 0 because the CSDs aren't running, the engines aren't on. And so that's a way to tell if the CSDs are operating correctly, and if so, to indicate a potential problem coming down the road. So something to keep an eye on. CSD disconnect switches are these guys right here. These are only resettable on the ground, and that's pretty common for almost every aircraft. So if the checklist calls for you to disconnect these, fine, but make sure you have the right engine, the right CSD switch. Do not kill these willy-nilly. You cannot reset these in the air. You must land. And once you kill your generators, all you've got is your APU, and if your APU doesn't work, all you've got is your battery, and you got 30 minutes of that. So do not kill these unless you absolutely have to. Below that, though, is your generator switches, and you have an off, an on, and a springing back reset position. Sometimes your generator will not catch when the engine comes on, and if that's the case, just reach up here and hit the reset and see if that fixes it. That's a real quick test to see if that works. Otherwise, you can just leave these guys on all the time, and when the engines spool up, you'll kick on and you'll hear the electronics switch over to that bus as the normal bus takes over from the APU. The APU does not have an off, it's only normal and reset right here, and the reason for that is because we can take the APU off the bus by actually using these switches here. So this is where the off switch is for the APU, and same thing with external power. These guys, the way you put these on the bus is to either have them in the off or the on position, and then that will take over. And the logic of the airplane, if the engines are running and the generators are on, they will take precedence over anything else. So the only way to get the APU to run the left bus, let's say, if the engine is running over here, you must put that in off. Otherwise, you won't get a blue light over here. You see that blue light there? That means that is actually powering that bus. Only one of these three things can power the bus at any given time. You cannot power the same bus with multiple sources. It is not the grid. You cannot do that. That requires synchronicity and things, and it's not set up to do that. So this will take over. This has priority. The APU has priority second. So if the engine's not on, but both the APU and external power is on, the APU will take precedence, and you'll get the light there. And then finally, if the APU is not available, the engine's not available, then the external power will be set to go. So what you can totally do is have the engines running, have the APU on, and the APU ready and shut an engine down, and when the engine spools down beyond the point when it can sustain electrical power, it will automatically switch over the APU. You don't have to do some weird dance of, oh, quick, get it, and that's how that can work. So, order of precedence: generator, APU, external power, in that order. Okay, moving on down. And again, if any one of these devices doesn't kick on after it reaches its normal speed, try hitting the reset. It's actually part of the flow that I do, where I hit the reset on both of these guys, and actually on the APU, as a part of the pre-flight, just to make sure there's nothing caught in there and messed up. It is also a normal habit to, once you've checked your voltages, to put this onto bat amp, because if you notice the excessive draw on the battery, that's always a problem, and you always want to make sure the charger is working. And that you saw that little bump there a second ago. That's the battery charger giving it a little bit of bump of juice just to keep it charged up. So when you're running the battery and don't have a external power APU source or something on, you'll see a drain on the battery here, which is good because it means the battery's working. But that's how that works. So following the left and right buses down, that's where they get all their energy from. That's where the arrows are pointing to the bus. You then have the galley power. This is what would power the coffee makers and other various electrical things in the cabin. So it's always a good idea to turn that on. People that drink coffee, I'm not one of them, but I'm told those people get very cranky if they don't have their coffee, those addicts. And so you always want to make sure you have that on. Right below that, you see we have an AC bus cross tie, and it's exactly what you think it is. You notice it's crossing the buses together. And basically what this does, if you were to lose all power on one bus, well, there's things on the left bus you might want to power, but if we don't have any way of powering that bus, how can we get power over that? Well, it's possible to power it via the cross tie, and the logic of the plane will do that for you. So you have a forced open. Open in electrical circuit logic means it is disconnected. The circuit is open. An open circuit is a disconnected circuit. There's a break in the circuit. It's open. If you think of a circuit as being the passageway through a door, if you open the door, there's no longer a connection between the left side of the door and the right side of the door because the door's open. So you close that door, and now it's a straight through path again. That's how to think of it. So open is a broken circuit. Closed is a completed circuit. But you don't have a closed. You have an open and an auto. So in auto, the airplane's logic will only connect this if the conditions are right to do so. But if you, as the pilot, feel like I do not want to send the one side to the other for whatever reason, you have the option to override the system by putting it into open. Down here is a DC cross tie, and it's a similar kind of situation, but it's just a close and open. So it stays in the open position, and if you need to cross tie the DC bus, you can do that, but they're both working right now. So these guys, you notice when we talked about the DC system is a direct current system, it's not an AC system, but you see it coming down in this line into the DC gauge, and that's because what's happening here in between this line and the gauge is a transformer rectifier. So a transformer steps the voltage up and down, and then the rectifier is a bunch of diodes basically that force the current to only go one direction. And so it changes the voltage down to the 24, 25 volts that it needs from the 115, and then forces the current to only go one direction, and voila, you have DC. So each side has two transformer rectifiers. So you have a transformer rectifier 1 and 2 on the left bus and 1 and 2 on the right bus, and that runs the DC system. So if you lose your generator, you lose your DC stuff too, unless you power it off the battery using emergency power. And that's what this big switch is for over here. The emergency power switch, the best way to understand this system is actually to really study the schematic, the electrical schematic, which is found in the manual that comes with the aircraft. It's in the electrical section at the very end, and you can see here it's a mess, and it kind of, you have to kind of really kind of watch this. And this is, real pilots have to memorize most of all this stuff and know all these systems. So if you really want to get in the weeds, I encourage you to try and understand how all this stuff works and where it goes. And you can see the red stuff is the DC stuff, the blue stuff is the AC side. You got the transformer rectifiers over here, the different switches and what they do and how they switch over and charge the battery, don't charge the battery, and and all that stuff. So we're not going to go into that. I'm going to let you read that on your own time. But know it's there, and it's very helpful to kind of understand the layout of the electrical system and how that works. Again, this is your DC loads, so it's showing you the loads of the DC system there, and that's your electrical. Again, it's for what you have to interact with it for the most part, unless you're having a failure, is very little. It's really just mostly about switching between APU, external, and regular generators. But if you do have an emergency, it's helpful to know what runs what and what you're going to lose if you don't have what and what you can do about it, because you can keep flying this aircraft. I've had, mostly in P3D, because I haven't had a lot of failures in Microsoft yet, but in P3D, I had it set where it was failing things on me all the time, and it was really fun to try and limp this plane home, given what I had left. And I never lost the plane. We always landed safely. I had an engine I lost half my electrical system one time. I've had more nuisance failures, like an APU that didn't work, but it's fun to do that. So I encourage you to do that. Last thing we'll talk about with the electrical system, though, is the APU, just because that's kind of an integral part of the electrical. And the APU is the master switch right here. You can totally just go ahead and go to start, and it'll snap back to run, but nothing's going to happen here for a little while, and I'll tell you why. So what's happening on the outside of the aircraft when you do that is, I have to change my views here to get down to where the APU is. So this right here, this area here is the APU inlet area, believe it or not. And the outflow for the APU is up here. This is a big gaping hole right there. But the inlet's right here. And so all of these little doors have to open up prior to APU start. And so when you go and put it in run, that's starting to happen. So let me see. Okay, run. Let's see. I think we see these guys. Yeah, see them start to open up? Right there. So they have to open up fully, and some ram doors open up. These all come into a certain place and a position, and it has to set itself up. So until it gets to that point, nothing's going to happen. So you can hit it to start and you won't see anything. But now if I hit start, it will immediately begin to fire. And so we'll see the this is the percent RPM on the N2 stage of the APU, which is a tiny jet engine in the back of the tail there. And then the exhaust gas temperature is rising up here. Once this needle gets into the green, that APU power available light should come on, and we can also go over here and check our APU gauges, and those should come up to about 115 hertz and 115 volts and 400 cycles. You can see, look at that, the generator is actually increasing, but that light doesn't come on yet because we're not at 115 volts yet. And nowhere near, and there was 400, boom, boom, light comes on. So at that point, you can engage the APU immediately. You need to wait about a minute for the air, and you won't get it right away anyway. But kind of unconveniently, the air readout, the pneumatic readout for that is down here, and we'll deal with that when we talk about the air system. That's a different video. But this is where you would put the air on and air condition colder. If you need that, we'll talk about that in the air system. But that's where you hit run, and then, like I said, the APU takes precedence, so watch what happens. See how it switched? All I had to do is turn it on, and it switches over automatically, and now we're on APU. And so those lights are on. That means the APU is now running the show. The external power is connected, so if I disconnect an APU, it switches back. But the APU takes precedence, as long as it's in the on position. And you can see now with what we're running, we're at about 70% of the APU generator. And that's not packs yet. So we're not running any air conditioning packs. They're going to draw a bit, and that's going to go up. And when you bring on very heavy loads like the packs, you want to engage them and give it a second to stabilize. Because if you hit them both at the same time, you can put so much draw on the system, it could actually pop a breaker. And the best equivalent to that is when you think about when you go to plug in, or someone in your house plugs in the vacuum and turns it on, and when they first hit that, and, and all the lights in your house dim for a second, that's because that AC motor in the vacuum has such a large initial power draw that it's actually dimming all of the systems, because the electricity, the current can't get to everything the same way. There's so much draw. And in that moment, all of that draw is going through that breaker. That's the most stress your breaker gets when that vacuum first kicks on. Once it's on and running, it actually takes a lot less power to keep the electrical motor running. they have a lot more starter current than they do when they're actually just running and normal. And same thing with these guys, because there's a lot of fans and stuff that are kicking on with the PAX kick on. And so the initial current draw is so high, you'll see this gauge jump and then jump back. And you want to make sure you don't kick them out at the same time or you can have problems. So again, a minute before you do the air, and then put the PAX on one at a time, let it stabilize, then put the next one on to protect your electrical system. Let's see here. So again, hit the reset there. It kind of just flickered for a moment. They're on and fine and stable. I think that's all we need to talk about for the electrical system. Like I said, you've got two different buses and different systems that run off of each bus. So if you lose a bus, you will lose certain systems, and especially when it comes to things like autopilot and captains and first officers control, some of those things are on left sides, some of them are on the right, and so that's where you may need to also switch over your computers, because one computer is going to be on one bus and one computer is going to be on the other bus. And so if you lose a computer because you lost a bus, you may have to switch those over too. So this is where it's good to know what's on what bus, and that again is all detailed in your manual, where you can go through and see that for your own edification. And then the last part of this is the circuit breakers. Obviously, we talked about this in the overview video, but these are the modeled circuit breakers. These ones back here, while they are visually depicted, they are not modeled. So you can't click them, you can't pop them, they won't pop on their own. These guys, though, you can pop, you can push back in and reset, and they can pop. So you always want to check these and look for that white strip. I'll pull one of them here, emergency DC. You right click to pull it, you see that white strip right there, that means that it's been popped. Left click to push it back in, and that pushes that back in. And that is, I think, the most of an overview we need to do for the electrical system for the MD-80. So this is, while this is all technically under Module 3, there's going to be a few of these videos because it takes so long to talk about the systems in depth here to go into these. So this is the 3.1 electrical. The next system we'll talk about the hydraulics, and then we'll get into the fuel and finally the air conditioning and pneumatic systems of the jet. All right. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it helpful. If you did, hit that like button and hit the subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. It helps the channel. You can catch me over on Twitch, twitch.tv/Mustafa, where I live stream almost every week, multiple times a week. And it's a lot of fun over there. Would encourage you to join that community. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. And you can also, and a much better way, would be to join the Discord. Link in the description below. And you can ask all your questions there to your heart's content about this jet or many other ones, because I fly many of these, and I love them all. And I love getting in-depth into the weeds like this because it's just a lot of fun. So hopefully this helped you on the electrical side, and it helped you to understand where those different components are and how they interact with the aircraft. And one last thing, bonus thing. I almost forgot. This one's a weird one. It's a quirky one, because you will see this occasionally as a failure, and you'll see it up here, and it'll be AC cross-tie lockout, because sometimes this system fails and will lock out, and the system will not cross-tie, even if you needed it to. Now, according to the manual, you're only supposed to reset the switch on the ground. I'm not sure why, but that's what it says. So I'm going to show you where it is. If you want to try to reset it in the air, that's up to you. But the manual says don't do it. But you can do it on the ground. And that's right here. Behind the captain seat, AC cross-tie lockout reset, use only on the ground. So, again, you have to use your scroll wheel to lift that guy up, and it's a spring-loaded switch, and you reset that and put that back down. And so if you get that message, and I have gotten that message before taking off before, that we had an AC cross-tie lockout, and thankfully I knew what that was, so I reached over and snapped it. But once you're in the air, you're technically not supposed to do it. I believe you can still do it, but you're not supposed to. And I'm sure a real pilot will come in and tell me why. But, yeah, that's what that is. So right at the end there, if you stuck around at the very end, you got a little bit of nugget of extra electrical knowledge on the MD-80. Hopefully it was helpful. We'll see you on the next one. Take care.